Every fan of The Shining knows this scene. It's towards the end of the Tuesday sequence. Wendy walks into the Colorado lounge to tell Jack about the impending storm and to offer to make him some sandwiches. As she approaches his desk, he pulls a sheet of paper from his typewriter and turns it upside down so she can't read it. There then follows the conversation where Jack starts to use very aggressive language. Now, he may not have appeared the most caring, paternal father and loving husband beforehand, but as we can see from Wendy's rather surprised reaction, this behaviour marks a turning point, a real change in his character. But what if Kubrick actually intended the change in Torrance's character to be driven by something more than just temperament? Ignoring for the moment the psychological implications of that suggestion, what if Torrance really had become someone else, an alter ego of sorts? It sounds far-fetched. After all, he looks exactly the same. But there are a couple of features in the shot above which lend credence to the idea. Both these features have been mentioned before, elsewhere by other commentators, but not with the same connotations I'm about to make. Firstly, the typewriter changes colour in this scene. Now, typewriters don't just change colour, so why might that happen? A typewriter was a writer's principal tool, their means of creative expression. Couldn't making the colour of the typewriter darker be symbolic of Jack Torrance becoming a darker writer? Now, admittedly, that's quite a leap of faith to make, and by itself at the moment not very convincing. So let's look at the other feature of the scene. You've no doubt seen this one before too. The sequence of shots in the scene is broadly as follows. Keep an eye on the chair behind Jack. When we first see it, the chair is present. Then cut to a shot of Wendy. Then cut back to Jack, and the chair is absent. Cut back to a shot of Wendy, and then back to Jack, and once again the chair is present. And then finally, there's a shot of Wendy. So why might this signpost a change in Jack's character? In an exhibit in the Stanley Kubrick archive is an annotated typewritten text of Stephen King's novel, back from when it was called The Shine. The notes on it were made by Stanley Kubrick himself, and on page 442 is an unusually specific scribble citing the John Frankenheimer film Seconds. This film specifically deals with dramatic, irreversible character change. In Seconds, the banker Arthur Hamilton, played by John Randolph, undergoes major surgery to become the artist Antiochus Wilson. Shortly after undergoing his character change, he takes a flight to his new home on the West Coast. It includes an interesting sequence of shots of a conversation with an air stewardess. Now let's juxtapose these shots from Seconds with the shots from the same scene in The Shining that we've just looked at. Watch the pillow behind Rock Hudson's head. The scene in Seconds starts with the air stewardess offering Rock Hudson a pillow. He places this behind his head. There is then a cut back to the air stewardess, followed by another cut to Rock Hudson, but this time with no pillow at the back of his head. A cut again to the air stewardess, followed by another cut to Rock Hudson, but this time with a pillow. And finally, a shot of the air stewardess. So is the disappearing chair a continuity error? Or is it deliberate? A modified quotation of a continuity error from another film? As continuity errors neatly add to the uncanny atmosphere of The Overlook, quoting one from another film really would be an imaginative and humorous tactic. And as Kubrick unusually specifically mentions its title, does the subject of that film provide us with a clue as to what is going on, i.e. character change? Still think it's a far-fetched suggestion? Well, in actual fact, there is another example of exactly this technique in the film which reinforces this argument. Unfortunately, it's a little too premature to disclose it just now. Instead, let's speculate about who Jack Torrance might be turning into. This time, the clue we're looking for lies in Stephen King's novel. Now, as an aside, you may think that the clues to interpret the film should just be textual, i.e. they should come only from the film itself. In fact, one of the findings of my research is that The Shining appears to be more of an ecosystem, comprising the US version of the film, the documentary Making The Shining, King's novel, archive exhibits and interviews from the period. This will be demonstrated over time as the presentations are developed. So why look at the novel to understand this character change? Well, Kubrick clearly demonstrates in his movie that the film and novel are closely interlinked, and that the novel contains pertinent elements which are not explicitly repeated in the film. One example is through the dialogue he uses in the scene following Danny's encounter with the twins in the corridor. Danny reminds himself of what Halloran said. They're just like pictures in a book. Only Halloran never utters those words in the film. He only uses them in the novel. thus proving that there are relevant, easily overlooked phrases in the book which contribute to the understanding of the film without being explicitly stated. Early in the novel, Wendy Torrance refers to Jack as the Eugene O'Neill of his generation, the American Shakespeare. So could Jack Torrance be turning into Eugene O'Neill trying to write a play? Could Torrance's famously repeated line, "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy," be interpreted as putting a lot of effort in but still no play has been written? Let's test the theory out. Eugene O'Neill is arguably America's greatest playwright. His stature as an artist is, however, countered by some of his failings as a human being. While, like many individuals have, he succumbed to alcoholism, he was also a poor father to his children. He disowned all three, and as adults his two sons committed suicide. Alcohol and poor parenting are both traits ostensibly exhibited by Jack Torrance, so Stephen King chose his analogy well. There are many well-known titles among O'Neill's plays. A Long Day's Journey into Night is probably his magnum opus and was partly based on his experience of tuberculosis. Its sequel, A Moon for the Misbegotten, included a non-speaking character called McCabe. Probably his most well-known work is The Iceman Cometh. Less well-known is his 1927 play Marco Millions, which starred Alfred Lunt in the lead role when it opened. Towards the end of Act 2, Scene 1 of Marco Millions, Marco Polo utters the line, "All play and no work makes Jack a dull boy." In other words, an inversion of the phrase which Torrance had typed out ad nauseam. The Iceman Cometh is also a title which resonates in the context of The Shining. It might jokingly be argued that the Iceman cometh at the end of the film when Jack is frozen in the snow. That shot is generally acknowledged to be a quotation from a final scene in Robert Altman's film McCabe and Mrs. Miller, starring Warren Beatty as well as Shelley Duvall. As previously mentioned, McCabe was also a name in A Moon for the Misbegotten. So, as it was Stephen King who suggested the analogy between Jack Torrance and Eugene O'Neill, does this mean that the cold ending he has complained of in Kubrick's film was actually the result of his very own description? But having now mentioned him, Warren Beatty's role in this argumentation goes even deeper. He and Jack Nicholson were firm friends, and before Nicholson had signed up to work for Kubrick, he had also agreed to work on a future film project which Beatty had been developing for years. The name of that film was Reds. Nicholson's character in that film was Eugene O'Neill. Quite a coincidence, eh? The actor chosen to play the role of aspiring writer Jack Torrance had also been chosen to play the future role of the very playwright Stephen King had likened his fictional character to. Nor does it stop there. Remember how Jack Torrance reacted when Wendy walked into the Colorado lounge? He inverted the page he was typing on so it couldn't be read. Well, when Louise Bryant, played by leading lady Diane Keaton, walked into O'Neill's study in Reds, Nicholson also inverted the paper he was writing on so it couldn't be read. So, was this a deliberate future hint back to The Shining on the part of Nicholson, implying that he knew what Kubrick was up to? Or might it just result from a technique the actor had to make a scene where he's working with paper more interesting? And what deeper reason might Kubrick have had for concealing from the film audience an analogy about Jack Torrance which is explicitly stated in the novel, one that could have been in the film with the simple addition of a line of script? Was he having some fun and games, a joke at our expense? Let's face it, turning Jack Torrance into the Iceman is quite witty if it's put into the context of Eugene O'Neill, especially given the fiery fate of the Overlook in the novel. Moreover, there is in fact a very playful extension to the playwright being part of the scenario, which supports that argument. I considered including it, but if you don't buy my argument so far, you won't buy that. So working on the assumption that you're not yet fully convinced of this sneakily concealed reference to Eugene O'Neill, maybe I should save that example for a later presentation, and instead try one last thing to convert you. The preface to King's novel makes explicit reference to Goya's Sleep of Reason Breeds Monsters. Its similarity to Jack's nightmare scene should be obvious to all fans of The Shining. The noticeable difference, other than the bats, is that the man in Goya's print is not screaming. So was this simply a way of bringing the Goya to life in The Shining? Or might Kubrick have also spotted the similarity to a scene in another film where the man is yelling? That scene occurs in a 1973 film directed by John Frankenheimer, the director of Seconds the film that we suggested was an indicator of Jack Torrance's changing character. It is from his adaptation of Eugene O'Neill's The Iceman Cometh. So just what can we conclude from all of this to help us understand the rest of the film? The idea to use O'Neill originated in King's novel. It was a clever choice on the author's part, as the playwright's personality substantially overlapped with Jack Torrance as an alcoholic and ostensibly abusive father. But rather than simply adding a line of dialogue to make it as explicit in the film as it was in the book, Kubrick appears to have been far more subtle. Does this suggest he was concealing something? A puzzle perhaps? It also implies that he was being both playful and tongue-in-cheek, which would suggest a light-hearted puzzle if there is one. One immediate thought might be that as Eugene O'Neill was a known future role for Nicholson, and as Shining is partly about seeing the future, could this have been a way for Kubrick to weave this aspect of Shining into the very fabric of his film? But Shining is not just about seeing things that haven't happened yet. It's also about seeing things which happened a long time ago. So maybe we should look to Nicholson's past for influences too. And if he did it for Jack Nicholson, what about Shelley Duvall, and indeed his other actors as well? Maybe the next presentation should investigate this line of thinking. So thank you for viewing this presentation. I hope the content was of interest, even if the production values left something to be desired. I'm afraid I'm not too gifted in that area. Also, please remember that this is just one small facet of the puzzle that is The Shining. To learn more, you'll need to follow the breadcrumbs, as it were, and view further presentations. So if you're interested in doing that, please remember to like, subscribe and share this one. Thank you.